Hi there, and welcome to Ranch Management Forum 2021. My name is Jenay Werle, and I'm a livestock and feed extension specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture based out of Yorkton. My presentation today will be on evaluating alternative feed opportunities. The goal of this presentation is to give you an idea of the factors to consider when looking at making feed from a damaged crop. From time to time, producers call me wondering about an alternative feed opportunity. Oftentimes, this happens in the fall when there's an early frost that damages crops before they're fully mature for harvest, but it can occur throughout the year for a variety of reasons. The purpose of this presentation is to leave you with a set of parameters to use when evaluating whether these feeds are truly an opportunity and not a potential liability. When evaluating whether or not an alternative feed opportunity is a good one for your operation, there are 4 key points that you should consider. The first is nutritional value. Will this add anything to the feed that you already have, and do you need it to? So in a case where you might have very good quality of forage, but not very much of that, you might be able to make do with more poorer quality forage or lesser nutritional value. Or another example might be where you have lots of high energy forage or feed, but you're looking to add some protein. So in a case like that, if you're looking for an alternative feed that has the potential to have high protein, it might be a good opportunity. We also want to look for any potential problems that might come up with the feed. So are there any anti-nutritional factors that are possible? That would include things like mycotoxins, nitrates, prussic acids, or any crop protection products. It's very important to make sure you know what type of products or chemicals have been used on the crop before you use them for livestock feed. If the crop was not grown on your own farm, be sure to ask your neighbor or the farmer that you're getting the crop from and double check to make sure that those products are safe. The third part is, will it fit your management style? So can it be easily incorporated? Farmers are pretty inventive and can make most things work, but you really need to decide how much of a headache you're willing to put up with before you go ahead and commit. And the fourth point is cost. This might be probably one of the most important of the 4, and it's really good to know that in advance. What is it going to cost you? To demonstrate each of these 4 points, we're going to look at a case study. So I had a producer that called me with an opportunity. He had a neighbor that had about 250 acres of hailed out oats that were hailed out in July. And it looked like it was a total loss. He wanted any of the regrowth to be silaged before the weeds set seed. And the producer felt that the fields were too far away from his home operation for chop silage, but he was wondering about the possibility of putting it up as baled silage. So he decided he was going to go ahead and give this a try, and he agreed to it, expecting to get about 200 bales out of this experiment. So the crop regrew surprisingly well with a significant amount of volunteer flax in it. Flax had been the crop the year before, and there was quite a bit of crop residue left over, so that's where that flax came from. The first batch, which was cut on, we'll refer to it as Field H, it was cut on August 28th and baled and hauled on August 29th. The producer applied a granular forage preservative, which was designed to be a fermentation aid with a Valmar mounted to the baler. The application rate was supposed to be 1 bag per 200 tons of forage. The way the Valmar was metering it out, the application was a little bit heavier than prescribed, but that should have been fine. And the producer commented that it was baled at about 50% moisture and it baled really nice. When he brought those bales home, they were placed into a pyramid stack. So there was 3 rows along the bottom, 2 in the center and 1 on top. And he covered it with silage plastic and then vacuum sealed it early the next day. And you can see here within the picture here, he's got a generator in the back of the side-by-side and a shop vac. And he just put a little hole in the side of the plastic, stuck the hose in, and then let that shop vac run for 20 minutes or so, I think, to just get as much of the air out of there as possible. It was a warm and windy day when this crop was cut and baled and hauled home. So they didn't finish hauling it until very late, and with the wind, they waited till the next day to get that plastic on. The second batch, which was Field R, that's what we'll call it, was cut on September 6th, and then it was baled, hauled, and covered on September 8th. The same forage preservative was applied, as was the case with Field H, and the air was all vacuumed out the next day on September 9th. Field R was wetter. It had a moisture content of 60%, and it was less mature than Field H. Here, the producer commented that it was harder to bale. The baler was plugging up quite a bit, and I think there was some problems even with just cutting it. So Field H yielded 290 1,600-pound bales. Field R gave us 336 1,600-pound silage bales, and there was also an additional 19 high moisture green feed bales. So what happened there is the producer ran out of plastic, and rather than trying to find some more, he just wilted down those green feed bales and used a different preservative product, something that was designed for higher moisture forage, and just to try and make use of these ones. On October 12th, the producer took some core samples out of the bales for feed testing purposes. So you can see here in the pictures, the producer used a bale probe that goes on the end of a forage drill, or pardon me, just a drill. And he cored into the bales through the plastic, into the center of the bale, just the way you would with a normal dry hay bale. When he pulled the sample out, he would have taped over that hole, and he would have repeated this a few times in every single stack so that he was getting a good representation of all the bales from throughout both fields. When he was done taking those samples, he would have came back with the shop vac and sucked out all the air again, and then sealed up those holes once more. So this is a picture. It might be a bit hard to tell, but this is what those forage samples looked like once they were taken with that core sampler. You can see in the red circle, that's a flax head, and in the green circle, that's an oat. The color here is really nice. There's very little, if any, signs of spoilage. It smelled really good, so the producer was pretty pleased when he saw this. The oats came off at a hard dough, and the flax seeds were formed but fairly immature. And this was pretty consistent for both of the crops. Here on Field R, you can see that there's more flax than showed up in the previous slide. So you can see there's a lot of that thin stemmy material. If you can see my cursor, here's some here and here, a lot more flax. But again, the samples from both of the fields, they had very little spoilage, and they smelled really nice. There was no sour smell, nothing kind of off about that. So the producer was optimistic that this was going to be good. So those feed samples were sent off to a lab for analysis, and we're just going to go through and see what we saw. So Field H is shown here underneath the blue arrow, and Field R, the silage bales, those show up here under the red. So what does this tell us? Field H was more mature than Field R, perhaps because the hail damage on Field R was more severe. Maturity is indicated by the lower crude protein, which is in the yellow circles, and by the higher neutral detergent fiber, which is down here in the teal circles. So the less mature Field R had higher protein than Field H, and a lower fiber than in the Field R than in Field H. The green circles here show us the difference in moisture content. The ideal moisture for baled silage is about 45 to 55%. 60%, which is what we see here in the R field, is still acceptable, but it's at the outer edge, so it's a little bit wetter than ideal. The blue circles here show the pH, and that can be an indication of fermentation and how successful the ensiling process was. So ideally, the pH would be 5 or lower. So this producer We'll need to make use of all of these bales before spring, as they are not likely to carry over without significant spoilage. So this is just an indication that ensiling or the ensiling process didn't go very well. The pink bar here shows that there was no prussic acid detected, and we'll discuss that a little bit more further on. And that leaves us here with the red circle, which are two very disappointing TDN or energy levels. Given the maturity of the oats and the presence of the flax, I had expected this number to be higher. The producer commented that he'd sampled from the center of the bales, and there seemed to be a lot of seed heads present around the outer edges of the bales. So he commented that he wondered if maybe the way the swath had fallen and the bales were formed, that maybe more of the grain was toward the outer edges and more of the stalk in the center. I don't know if that's a valid point or not, but it was something that the producer had commented to me. So, I just wanted to mention too, the high moisture green feed bales, those were tested as well. So these came from field R, and they were allowed to dry down. They were wilted down, and they baled at 25% moisture with a different hay preservative product. These bales heated, so the samples that we took with the core sampler did show a little bit of signs of spoilage, but they showed significant signs of heated. So what came out was a tobacco color. It had caramelized. And also when we look at the effects of that heating, it took that forage crude protein from 11.39 all the way down to just under 5%. So that just demonstrates that the damage that heat can do to the bales. This picture also shows that the bales have sprouted. It's a bit tricky to see in the foreground here, but in the background you can see there's little bits of tufts of green as the oats have sprouted and are growing. It's also worth noting that the bale probe was warm to the touch after sampling these bales, so that's something to keep in mind as well. And just as an aside, heating can happen very easily, and people often comment that the cows really like those tobacco or caramel colored bales, and they think they may could feed. And from a palatability perspective, they really do. The cows really like them. The flavor must be nice on them, but from a quality perspective, you lose a lot of quality that way. So in a case like this is comparable to straw now, what's left for feed value. So that's something important to remember if you run into a case of heating with any of your feed. So did this work? The first stack was opened on November 27th. The producer started on the bales from field R first because they were the higher moisture, and he wanted to make sure he used them up before they spoiled or froze solid on him. Opened up the stack, and they retained good color and they smelled really good. So that looked promising as well. There was some ice buildup up along the tops of the bales. So if you can see here, again with my cursor, just on the tops of those bales, I'm guessing that's due to condensation that may have built up on the tops of the plastic and then dripped down onto the bales, just my guess. We see here there's a small amount of white mold here on the outer. This is one of the bales that was on the outer edge of the stack. A very small amount. I wouldn't be too worried about this. But it's also worth mentioning that this stack was open when it was kind of a seasonally normal temperature, which is, fairly cool for the end of the end of November. The producer opened up a second stack kind of towards the mid to end of December, and where he's located, it was pretty warm. It was often above zero at that time, and surface mold had become a real problem once those stacks were opened up. So ideally, cold weather would be really helpful in this situation to prevent some of that surface mold from growing. Again, this is just another view of these bales from that first stack that was opened back in November. You can see here there's quite a bit of oats, but if you really look closely, you can see in here there's the flax, and there's some flax sticking out here as well. This is ice accumulation here. It's not mold, it's ice. So just something to look at there. The other question, or the other thing the producer was worried about, was palatability. Will the cows eat this? With that high flax content, he was a bit concerned that they wouldn't like the taste of it. But luckily they did. The bales had been net wrapped, and when the producer went out to feed them for the first time, the cows were going after them even before he could get the net wrap off. So that was a good sign. They seem to really enjoy it, or really like it. So now that we've kind of looked at this case study, let's go back and, using those 4 points from the beginning of the presentation, let's evaluate, was this a good opportunity? Starting with the nutritional value. The more mature field H has sufficient protein to meet the needs of gestating cows, and the less mature field R has enough protein for lactating cows. So neither sample would have enough energy on its own to meet requirements, but this producer has other feeds that he can use to complement the bale silage and meet nutritional needs. So I gave this one a check mark. Even though energy wasn't great, protein was good, and this does add value to this producer's feeding program. The next point is, are there any problems or any anti-nutritional factors that we need to be aware of? So I mentioned prussic acid earlier when we were looking at the feed test results. Green or immature flax that has undergone trauma, such as drought or trampling, frost or hail, for example, this can create a compound known as prussic acid. Animals that consume prussic acid can asphyxiate and die. It was unlikely that prussic acid was going to form in this crop, given the stage of maturity, the long length of time since the original hail incident, and the fact that this was all cut and baled prior to a frost. However, the producer did have some concerns, so we did get the forage tested for the presence of prussic acid. None was detected. The other thing to watch here, of course, would be spoilage or mold. Initially, there was very little signs of spoilage or mold. And as I said, as the temperatures warmed up and he got further into the stack, there was some more mold that came about. So he did, it was just on the surface. So he was able to remove that moldy outer portion along with the net wrap and feed it that way. But it's definitely something to be concerned about when you are feeding mold, and the presence of mycotoxin can have some negative effects, especially on gestating cows. Will this fit your management style? That was the third point. And when I asked the producer about that, he said, not exactly, but he's making it work. So in this case, the producer entered into this arrangement thinking that he was going to get about 200 bales, but he ended up with 626 of these silage bales. So his typical feeding program involves bale grazing his cow herd, the mature herd, while supplementing, while also bale grazing the first and second calvers, but supplementing them daily with a small amount of grain and silage just to make sure that their energy requirements are met, as well as any thinner, older cows also get a bit of silage and grain. His calves are backgrounded on a silage and grain program, and he has a horizontal auger mix wagon, so he couldn't really incorporate these bales into that program without shredding them, which would add to the cost of the feed. He couldn't spot these bales in advance out in the field for the cows the way the dry hay had been for bale grazing, just because they would spoil that way. So he's having to feed the cows a lot more manually than he typically would at this time of the year, sorry. So given the high moisture and the pH of these bales, it is not an option for him to carry them over into the spring. So he's going to have to use them up and make sure that he's spotting them regularly, putting them out for about 2 or 3 days worth of feeding at a time. So I gave the first 3 points a check mark. It doesn't fit perfectly, but the producer's making it work in this situation. The fourth point, and the one I said might be the most important, is what will it cost? And this one, I gave it an X. And we're going to look at the cost associated with this project. So what did it cost this producer? On a per bale basis, he spent $2.45 a bale on plastic. His preservative product was $1.61 a bale. He estimated that his cutting was $3 a bale and his baling was $10 a bale. His cost for net wrap twine was $1.10 a bale. To haul it home and to get it loaded was $5 a bale, and his neighbor charged $50 a bale for the forage, which brings the total to $73.16. So at first blush, for a 1,600-pound bale, he thought that was pretty decent. But when we took that and compared it to dry hay, as on an as-fed basis, we're looking at 4.6 or 4.5 cents a pound, cut, baled, hauled, wrapped, everything, which seems great. But we have to take the moisture out. So you'll remember field H is 50% moisture, field R was 60% moisture. So when we take out the moisture and compare these on a dry matter basis, we're looking at 8.7 cents per pound for field H and 11.5 cents per pound for field R. So this was expensive feed. And that leads us to the final question. Was this a good opportunity? I'll leave that to you to decide. For this producer, his comments were to do it over again. There was too many unknowns when he made the original arrangements. So there's probably things, knowing what he now knows, he would have done some things differently. Next time he would set a maximum on the number of bales so that he wasn't committed to, once he started, to finishing it all. He would price them on a dry matter basis instead of just by the bales hauled home. He also said he wouldn't stack them 3 high. He would stack them either 2 high, or tube style would be better, but he doesn't have any equipment. He doesn't have a wrapper or any of that. So the stacking was simple for him, but commenting too with some of the winds that we've seen here through the winter, that's hard on that plastic because you can suck as much air out as possible, but there is still a little bit in there, and it did get to flapping a bit on him. So he had a few tears that he had to keep an eye on. So in summary, alternative feeds can be a good addition to your regular feed program. It's important for you to consider how well the feed can be incorporated into your existing management style. If you're short on feed, you might be more willing to put up with inconvenience than in a time where you have lots of feed. Know your cost, don't make assumptions, and pencil it out as best you can with the information that you have. And it's also very important to evaluate the risk of quality being less than expected. So in this case, there had been a discussion about what would happen if this were a total wreck and these bales were completely unusable. And I don't know what the specifics of those arrangements were, but I think there was some risk that would have been shared between both parties. But you need a plan B, especially if you are relying on this feed to get your cows all the way through winter. So with that, I would just like to thank you for tuning into my presentation and for your participation in Ranch Management Forum. If you have any follow-up questions to this presentation, please do feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to answer them. And with that, I'll end the presentation.